Welcome to A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy where we talk about some of the most pressing issues facing HR professionals and business leaders. From fair treatment of employees to fostering transparency in the workplace, we'll explore how to create an environment where people don't just have to come to work, but want to. So, if you're feeling blue, tune in and join the conversation so you don't end up with a case of the Mondays.
Welcome to another episode of A Case of the Mondays. My name is Rameez Kaleem, your podcast host, and in today's episode, we're discussing diversity and faith. And we have our first ever guest on the podcast. I'm delighted to welcome Sahar Zahid, who is the Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Haberdashers Boys School, Chair of the charity MYUK, Trustee at Nither Trust, a grassroots educational trust charity, and was on the board for the Muslim Cultural Heritage Centre. Best known for their kitchen, where Meghan Markle launched her cookbook many years ago. So I'm delighted to have Sahar on the podcast today, particularly because when I first set up 3R, it was, it's just quite tough doing everything on your own and putting all the content and social media. And Sahar was one of the few people that was following 3R strategy at the start. So I thought we need to have you. I think it makes sense to have you as one of our first guests, given that you were one of 3R strategy's first supporters.
That's lovely.
Welcome, Sahar.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
So diversity is a hot topic, and a lot of people are discussing diversity, but something that doesn't always get mentioned in the conversation is faith. Although I think we have started to see, I saw a lot more posts this year in Ramadan, a lot of companies talking about it and colleagues supporting it. But still, I think it's not really in that conversation as much as other things when it comes to diversity. But before we get into why, Sahar, how would you define diversity within the context of faith?
It's a really interesting point you made. And if I think back, I don't think I made the realization about the relationship between diversity and faith, and how you're absolutely right. It sometimes is the forgotten characteristics. If we go back to basics, we have 9 protected characteristics under the Equality Act, and faith and religion is one of them. And yet, I think up till now, a lot of effort and a lot of attention has been paid to some of the other characteristics for a variety of reasons. I think there's an element of fear as well when it comes to faith, fear to get it wrong, to offend. There's also not enough information out there. That is definitely changing. And it's also really interesting because when it comes to faith, out of all the protected characteristics, as an individual, it's a very personal thing, faith, and it can be also a very private thing. And so when, as organizations, we try and address it, it really can be a minefield for people. I appreciate that completely. And so how do you, try and meet the needs of those who belong to a faith, those who don't belong to a faith, but also within faith groups, there's a variety as well. And so when you are trying to address faith as diversity, there's a lot of learning to be done, and a lot of, I'll say, risks. And when I say risks, I mean kind of, taking a deep breath and taking those first steps and hoping it works out. You're right. We saw this Ramadan, for example. You could see organizations were going out of their way, trying to do a lot. And it's these steps that actually make a difference. If I think about being a Muslim and Ramadan and how important Ramadan is to me, to be able to then say the organization I work for knew I was fasting, kind of put in guidance on how to support me while I was fasting, but also really importantly, celebrated the month with me, celebrated the end of the month with me. That's really important stuff. And so I'm glad to see that organizations are trying to address faith as one of the protected characteristics and recognizing it as a very important part of the work we do in diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, I think that's, it's an interesting point around the protected characteristics because, we do a lot of work around equal pay, and I'm always talking about the Equality Act, obviously the one that we look at in particular is gender, because that's the one that has all the data. But
Yes.
I think it is forgotten about that race and religion is one of the protected characteristics. People are quite protective of all the characteristics in the Equality Act, whereas I know it's very early on in the podcast, but I'm going to get controversial already. It just feels like faith or belief is one of those protected characteristics where it's more acceptable and more common for people to openly say, I don't like this, I don't like faith. Or you can have somebody like Stephen Fry or Ricky Gervais going on an interview on TV and saying, oh, this is stupid, this is ridiculous. But you could never do that about any of the other protected characteristics. So why do you think that it's more acceptable to do this with this protected characteristic than maybe something else?
Well, I think it's really important for us to recognize that, firstly, you're right with the other protected characteristics, let's just say race. And whilst it's not perfect, I don't think that there's been a very long journey and a lot of time for us to have to come to this point. It hasn't just been something that, was always the case. That possibly is the same for faith. But I also look at my own personal faith journey. I look back to my school experience. I had a great school experience. But because no one told me this, and there was nothing explicit in this, faith was something that you left at the door when you entered school. Faith was something you left at the door when you entered the workplace. I don't know why, but when it comes to faith, we really make it a very private, very personal thing for perfectly legitimate reasons, but possibly also for it's a protectionist thing as well. You're trying to protect yourself. And so maybe because we are so private about faith, that then allows the opportunity for misinformation, the opportunity for things to be said that may not be appropriate to be said usually when it comes to other protected characteristics. That is changing. And I think, faith is becoming less so of a private thing. And as that continues to happen, hopefully we will see a change in that dynamic.
I agree about the personal private element because, I think for me, it always has been quite a private thing. And maybe even 10 years ago, when I used to work I often say when I used to have a job, but I still have a job. when I used to work in the office, at the start of Ramadan, often people wouldn't even know that I was fasting. I remember I was in this meeting once, and you know how lack of sleep is a real challenge, and it was an early morning meeting. I struggle in morning meetings anyway. But I was just falling asleep and just like drifting off, and I could see a couple of people sort of laughing, thinking, oh, he's finding this meeting really boring, not realizing that actually, early mornings, lack of sleep. And I hadn't told anyone. And I think when I was in office, I was always quite private, whereas now I probably feel more able to speak about faith and religion. I don't know if there's feel like a responsibility, but I guess the culture is changing.
Yeah, the culture is changing. And I think a lot of that comes from you as a person, as individuals. Yeah, there is probably a responsibility, not to get sentimental on you, but, paving the way for future generations to make it easier for them as well. I know I definitely feel that. There are certain actions I take that maybe possibly don't make any difference to my experiences, but I know doing it will make it easier for other people. But I think about, for example, when I wanted to pray at work, I never kind of went out of my way to say, don't mind me, I'm just going to pop out for 5 minutes to pray. Mm-hmm. It was always, I'm just going to pop out, I'll be back soon. And again, no one kind of showed any disdain for my choice to go and pray. I just took it upon myself to keep that to myself.
But do you think that people keep this more private because of how others might react? Because I think, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, I think a lot of the times we celebrate diversity as long as people think the same and to some extent speak in the same way. Where, I think, when people have an accent, for example, sometimes you have a different perception, for example, about their competence. And I'm saying that as someone who wasn't born in this country, and I probably still have an accent, or I definitely did have an accent. So I think when it comes to faith, there's a rare recognition that people are different. And is that something you think makes people be more private about this in the workplace, because you don't want to come across as different? You just saying, oh, I just want to fit in, and I'm going to keep this part of my personal life personal and not discuss it with people.
Yeah, definitely. I don't want to make people go out of their way. I don't want to cause any issues. There's a lot of psychological study you could put into that, the kind of not bring attention to myself. There's also, if you think about what's happening around the world, there are, geopolitical reasons around faith and society's relationship with faith. You wanted to get controversial, let's go there. But if I just think about the hijab and wearing the hijab or the headscarf, you have, some cultures who are calling for the removal of the hijab, and no woman should be made to wear it, and then that's it, point blank. And then you have other societies where it's compulsory that a woman wears it. And okay, I could go on a rant on why it's anyone's business, but there are political elements as well when it comes to faith. And then I think, I was in year 12 when 9/11 happened, and suddenly my faith was kind of on everyone's tongues and everyone's attention and so on. So there must have been a point where I kind of, if I don't bring attention to my faith, no one will kind of make connections with whatever's happening somewhere else in the world and so on. I'm sure that came into play and has carried on for years. There's a lot of work that needs to go into educating, definitely. But I think those of us who choose to have a faith also kind of unlearning certain practices. I think back to my parents who came to the UK as immigrants. Again, they probably had to work so hard at trying to fit in, not seem different, not bring attention to themselves. And I am certain a lot of that has been passed on to me, even though it didn't need to be, and kind of unraveling all of that. Now, we're talking about faith, and we'll probably come to a point where we'll discuss this a little bit more, but it's not just faith. There'll be so much more that's, those characteristics that we talked about at the beginning don't live on their own. So I am just the faith characteristic. You are just the male. No, the idea of intersectionality is such an important one. And so there'll be so many things that impact how we address faith in the workplace. And it may not even be faith at all.
There obviously we're talking from our perspective at the moment, with the lived experience of having to practice your faith and being Muslim. But there are obviously so many different faiths, and I think there's also maybe I don't know if you find this, but a misconception that all of these different faiths, just because this is the history, that they don't get along or they don't like each other. Because, if I think about somebody of faith, I probably have a lot more in common with them, because they're also trying to navigate the same challenges. So is there something for us to work with a lot of the other faith groups to try and say, how can we make race and belief a more accepted, or I guess important characteristic in the workplace?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because it was one at school we introduced a multi-faith room, and whilst I was trying to navigate, how this room would be used, who would use it, at what time, etc., it's when the realization of how many similarities there were in our school community between the faiths and religion and belief and so on. And I think that's a really important point. Once you start, addressing faith, yes, there are definitely differences, and as an organization, you will need to try and address those differences. But actually, once you start the work, you start meeting the needs of so many people who, I don't know, at first sight, you would never think they were similar, suddenly have very similar needs. And, you think about, for example, the Sabbath and the prayers for the Jewish community, there are so many similarities in that. You think about fasting and how many religions actually have an element of fasting within them. So it's once you start scratching that surface, you start realizing that actually, I personally think the work isn't that hard. And if you are responsible for D&I, and if you are responsible for people in your organization, it's about knowing who to get support from, because there will be people of faith within that workplace who will be more than happy and more than willing to guide you, support you, put you in touch with the right people, so that it's not about you as an individual who may have zero experience in faith. That's perfectly plausible. Having to now go and read up and work on it, so on. No, go to the organization and see who can help you and who will support you, and you'll find that the work's made so much more easier if you do that.
So I know you have your role of diversity and inclusion at HABS. What would you say are some of the biggest challenges that you face in this role, and what are some of the misconceptions and stereotypes about your faith that you come across?
I'll start with the challenges. I think one of the I'm very fortunate that I work in a place where actually my colleagues want to do better. My colleagues recognize the importance of the work that I do, and I think that makes all the difference. You can sometimes hear horror stories of half the battle is actually trying to get people on board, and so I'm really fortunate in that. Now, having said that, you are working with perfectly competent people who have worked for so many years, have achieved wonderful results for their students, and then you come along and you say, but if you do it like this, it'll be better. And that's a really hard thing. That's, I think, a really difficult thing to go up to someone who is a professional and has done things a certain way and achieve the results that they need to then be told you need to do it differently. I think the other challenge, and this isn't unique to my workplace, I think this may even be a generational thing, and I often say this to our students actually. For us, the older ones, the staff, the adults in the workplace, we're having to do a lot of unlearning. We are the people who grew up on some really shady comedy shows where it was okay to make fun of people and it was okay. I just think, forget the hardcore stuff. I'm thinking Friends, for example. You watch Friends now and you think, ooh. And so we're having to do a lot of work on learning things that were okay or saying things that were okay and suddenly they're not. And we know they're not, but that takes work. Whereas the students we teach, it's a lot more black and white. They come from a place of they've always known it's not okay. And I think that's a real challenge as well. If I think about your second part of the question about stereotypes and misconceptions, for your listeners, I'm a Muslim woman who wears a headscarf. So I am what you would call visibly Muslim or visibly religious. I don't think many people would be confused about identifying me as Muslim. And so with that, I think comes a lot of misconceptions from what people may hear in the news or people may, read or their thoughts. So there have often been, and I think that was more so when I was younger, to be fair, but often many people have, microaggressions or comments where they don't realize they're doing it. And they'll say, oh, I never knew you were so confident. Or, oh, I'm really surprised you're into football. So it's really small things that if it was said to someone else, you may not think anything about it. And when I've kind of poked a little bit more, and what does that mean and so on, what it comes down to is I thought you were a quiet, shy, retiring Muslim woman who, because that's the impression I've always had. Those are kind of the things that I've had to carry for a while. And whilst I don't go out of my way to kind of break down those misconceptions, I kind of just let my work and my voice do that for me. It can be annoying, I'll be honest with you. It can be frustrating as well. I'm now in a place, I'm older, I'm more confident. I don't really think about it. So there will often, someone will once in a while just say something. And I know that my younger self would probably have thought about it for a good while, got upset and kind of thought of all the different responses I would have made. I don't do that anymore because I am of the belief that it's not on me. It doesn't have to be, except that again, we go back to the point about sometimes we carry this responsibility for others. And so now if I ever call someone out or try and have a conversation about what does that mean? Why would you say that? Why do you think that? I'm probably doing it more so because I worry about the impact on another Muslim woman, a younger Muslim woman who may not have the confidence to not be affected by it. Weirdly, I think, and again, it's just the time that we have lived in and we were born in. A lot of what's happened post 9/11, the Iraq War, Afghanistan, all of those things have, I think, unfortunately impacted what people's opinions are of me, my choice to wear a headscarf, and my religion, to be honest. Having said that, we live in London, and I happen to think London is one of the best places to live in. I know I could have it a lot worse. I know the fact that I get to walk around with a scarf on my head is one of the greatest privileges of my life. That I can, participate in podcasts and talk about my choice to be religious as a positive are all blessings, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I know you mentioned 9/11 a couple of times.
Yeah.
And I think people don't realize how much of an impact that had. And, there are not many events in my life, but you can almost think of your life pre 9/11 and post 9/11 and how it changed. I remember the first day getting on the tube the next day to get to work. It was scary. And you just felt like everyone was just staring at you.
Yeah.
And I guess, some of that translates onto the workplace as well, because a lot of people, they're influenced by what they see in the media and what they hear. When you say to people, you shouldn't be saying that, or, you're not allowed to say that, do you ever get the response, oh, political correctness has gone mad?
I'd say few and far between. Now, there might be an element of who I surround myself with. I'm not going to kid myself. And also probably too scared to say it to me. Maybe they're thinking it. No, but you do. And look, D&I is a long time coming, okay? The work that I am doing in education or any other industry is a long time coming. If you're asking me, we're probably late. So there's nothing about this that I think, it's a nice to have. No, this stuff needs to be happening in the workplace. We should be, as employers and employees, this should be part and parcel of everything we do. So I make no apologies for that. But what I do appreciate is that, one, not everyone is on the same page for a variety of reasons. Some of them are legitimate. I talked about this idea of how we grew up and what was okay and what wasn't okay and so on. There's a lot of work that goes into unlearning that, and I appreciate that. I get that. And I think if I can, as the person responsible for D&I, find a way to get everyone on the same page, that's really important. Now, that's not going to always be the case. Not everyone's going to feel like you. You're right. And it's going to be really difficult. And there are some really challenging conversations to be had. So we've had to have a lot of challenging conversations and uncomfortable conversations. And sometimes just sitting down and taking the time to have those conversations actually really helps. Sometimes you have to accept that you're not going to win every single battle. And actually, as long as you're doing the work, I mean, look, the main aim of the work that I do is about making sure that everyone feels included, everyone feels represented, and they feel like they belong. If I can do that on the whole, then I'm comfortable with saying I didn't change everyone's minds. I'll give you, I'll call it a funny example. So obviously we had the World Cup in Qatar last year. And that was a really interesting experience because you had like a wide array of opinions from, crazy about football. They can host it on the moon for all I care. I can't wait. You had that all the way to, I love football, but there is no way I'm watching a single match because I feel so strongly about this and this and this and this. So you had all of that like wide spectrum. And it was really important that people got an opportunity to share that, these are legitimate opinions and it's okay to feel that way. But I think what was even more important was that they heard each other. You spoke about this idea of lived experience a bit earlier. And I think lived experience can be really well exemplified by the World Cup, weirdly, because what you started to see was that people were coming at this on the most part, and I talk about individuals as opposed to media and what was happening elsewhere, but in the workplace, people were coming at this from their lived experience. There would be one individual who the excitement that the Eastern world was going to be hosting the World Cup, that it was going to be given the platform to do so, and sharing culture and sharing traditions was probably one of the most exciting things to be happening. And then you'd have someone else who was gay and just felt they would not be welcome. And so therefore, having the World Cup in a country that does not accept that person's existence, for them was a hard pill to swallow. Lived experience for both of them. But until those conversations actually happened, you wouldn't be able to see that. And it was the sitting down and having those conversations and explaining that, look, you're not going to change my mind. This is how I feel, but this is why I feel it, was really, really important. And I imagine that was happening, in a number of organizations, in a number of circles. Now, it's a shame because I think how that whole situation was shown in the media could have been done a lot better. But I know that it was happening in organizations and I know it was happening within people. And I think that's really important.
Okay, so I'm going to dig deeper into this example because I think you're speaking with your diversity inclusion perspective, obviously, but
yeah.
I'm also going to talk as a football fan.
Sure.
Who's excited about the World Cup, and it has been about previous World Cups, and somebody who watches all the pundits and all the coverage. And I think this is where a lot of the unconscious bias comes in, where people genuinely feel that they care about a particular issue. But if you compare the last World Cup,
sure,
which was in Russia,
yeah,
right, and look at the human rights record of Russia, and they invaded Crimea just a couple of years before the World Cup took place. So we're talking about thousands of people getting killed. Mm-hmm. And there was no outcry at the same level anywhere comparable to what happened in Qatar. A country which is not on this, you could say is not on the same level in terms of human rights abuses as Russia. It has a lot of other issues. But do you think that this is also partly related to the fact that you have a country, like you said, in the East, not the West, so they're seen as different. Yeah. It's a non-white country. There you go, I've said it.
Yeah.
A country of faith and belief. And so these are different people, and hence it's a lot easier for us to criticize and say they don't deserve this. But if it's in the West, in Russia, even though, human rights abuses might be worse, but it's okay. I mean, you didn't see Gary Lineker do a monologue against Russia. He said it was actually okay. So why is there such a difference here? And is that unconscious bias that is fueled by the media coverage, or is just the unconscious bias that we actually sometimes miss in the workplace as well?
I mean, there's definitely lessons to be had or learn from what happens in the workplace. I do think in this very subject, actually, what happened in the workplace was probably much better than what was happening in the media and entertainment in general. I think you said it. It's about the ease of what we can say and actually get away with what we're saying as well. There's that element. Look, don't get me wrong. I felt it was hypocritical. I actually, it's really interesting you say that you mentioned Lineker, because I was very upset when Messi was given the Qatari cloak, which if anyone just kind of does like a very quick Google search, it's actually a great honor to be gifted that, and costs a lot of money. And when somebody gives it to you, it's all about elevating you and telling you how special you are. Now there is such an opportunity there to learn about culture, to appreciate what was happening, and it was completely missed. That's disappointing. I'll be honest with you. It's disappointing when it comes from someone who is so highly regarded, who is so well respected. And in that case, I mean, he should have done better. I think his organization should have done better. Look, yes, D&I is at the front of people's minds, and the work we do is at the front of people's minds. It doesn't mean we're there, and it will take a while. And also, we will be better at some things and not so good at other things. As an organization, we have to be really brave to have that champion, that person who is, encouraged to call us out when we do get it wrong. Now, that's a big ask for the individual and the organization, but it's actually really, really important. I always talk about D&I having to be at the table. And what I mean by that is actually every decision that we make as an organization, at every level of the organization, D&I has to be at the forefront. And I think had the BBC had the team who was writing the monologue had that, maybe we wouldn't have had the situation we had. I mean, I'm also not naive, and I know that when it comes to these things, there's also an element of what's going to get us the most shares, what's going to get us the most likes, etc. What's going to get us the most attention on social media, obviously. And so that, a nice opening monologue about, and here we are in Qatar, it's a country in the Middle East, host this many, is not going to be the same as what we got in the end. Social media is actually a really, really interesting point to make, because it comes with the D&I role without you realizing it. You find yourself, you're up against social media more than you are up against individuals in your organization.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, social media is definitely a challenge. You talked about being at the table, and it reminded me of this book. It's called No Hard Feelings. And it's not a book about diversity and inclusion, but there's a chapter on it. And I always like this quote, which the authors say, diversity is having a seat at the table, inclusion is having a voice, and belonging is having that voice be heard.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of diversity initiatives, maybe it's probably changing a little bit, is just really focused on having a seat at the table. So you're looking at your statistics and what percentage of ethnicities do you have. And it reminded me of a time when I had a job. And it was, I don't think I thought about this at the time, but we had an award ceremony to go to as an organization, because they were nominated for a diversity award. Mm-hmm. And it was really sort of fancy awards dinner. I had to get a tuxedo and the really, really expensive tickets. And we were sitting there, and so I literally had a seat at the table. And I was thinking, half of these people have never even spoken to me. And I probably had a seat at the table because they're thinking, maybe I'm being really harsh here, it's a diversity award. We need some other people on the table.
It's not good look.
It's not a good look. And so I think, how much of that do you think is happening where, we're giving people a seat at the table, but it's just so that you look good from a D&I perspective?
Yeah. I mean, how can you tell if you are not going beyond giving someone a seat at the table? Nothing changes. Okay. If nothing changes, and I mean that in terms of, who's actually applying to work for you, how happy people are when they're working for you, what are the figures on promotion, how long do they stay working for you, then actually nothing changes. And there is definitely a danger of that happening. D&I, to put it crudely, is flavor of the month. Okay, but maybe flavor of the year if you like. What that means is, I'd hate to see it, but what could happen is that next year, the year after, it would just fall off the agenda. it won't be, if you're not serious about this, and if you don't value the importance, the practical importance of it as an organization, the implications it has for you as an organization, both positive and negative. You commit to D&I, there are real positive outcomes you can get out of this. And if you don't see that happening in your organization, then you can be sure it's a tick box exercise. And I'm sure that's happening. It's a shame, but I'm sure that's happening. But know that if that's why, as an organization, you've appointed a D&I person, or you've had an away day where you've had a lecture on D&I and nothing has changed in your organization, then you've really just wasted energy. And that worries me sometimes. I think, the minute funds need to be cut down, is D&I going to be one of the first one that gets cut in organizations? The minute it gets too difficult, it gets too uncomfortable. I know in school we had to have uncomfortable conversations, but those conversations were really necessary for us to recognize where we were. But the minute it gets uncomfortable, the minute you have to call out certain practices and you walk away because it's the easier thing to do, then you've really not benefited from D&I. And that's a shame. But having said that, we really have come a long way. There are certain things that you hear about happening in the workplace that I know weren't happening when I was a graduate looking to work. So I'm hoping that we keep making those strides, and some industries it's going to be much easier than others. Some individuals are going to find it much easier than others. I think if you are I keep going back to loud because I know I'm loud, but if you're loud and comfortable and confident in yourself, your organization may not know it, but actually you're going to be a good thing for that organization. And whilst it's great to have those people, not everyone's like that. So we also need to make room for those who are quietly committed as well.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, that things have changed significantly. I remember early on in my career, I was, I've worked in HR, and so often I'm the only guy in the team.
Sure.
And usually I am the only brown person.
Yeah.
And I remember there was a conversation taking place in a work amongst a group of people, and they were saying, basically discussing how there are too many foreigners in the UK. Wow. And I think suddenly realized that I was there. And then one person just looked at me and said, "Oh, but Ramiz, we don't mean you.
We don't mean you.
You're one of us." And I think that's the thing around, luckily those sort of conversations don't take place in the workplace anymore. But I think it really does highlight the fact that we consider people to be one of us as long as they think the same way, as long as we feel, they have the same interests. But the minute they're different, and I think that's where faith and belief comes in, because I think that's the one thing that people really feel makes someone different. Yeah. So to end, if there's one thing that you would recommend other D&I people or HR people to focus on from a diversity, inclusion or belonging perspective, what would that advice be?
I think if you are starting this from scratch, it's have the conversations, host the group and ask, what are the needs? You can be perfectly clear that, hey, as an organization, we may not be able to meet all the needs, and that's perfectly fine. But actually, let's have a list. Let's break down what are the needs of this particular organization. Even in creating that list, you are possibly going to find that actually there's a lot of it that you can do with ease without even having to think about it. But just having that conversation, creating the space to have that conversation is going to mean the world to your employees, and is going to open up the door to so many things. Everyone, regardless of where you work, we all want to belong. Whatever that looks like, we want to belong. But we want to belong without leaving a part of ourselves, like I said at the beginning, at the door when we enter. What I call the easy wins? Okay, the easy wins for one organization might be a spare room where someone can go pop in during lunch break and pray. Actually, you already had the spare room. That person's already on a lunch break. the commitment from you as an organization actually was next to nothing. I'd say also really importantly, come from a place of not just acceptance. I think we're beyond acceptance. Come from a place of celebration, bring everyone in, if you like, into the fold. Let's celebrate these differences. Let's celebrate what makes your religion special. Let's celebrate your celebrations with you. Again, that adds to me feeling like I belong to this organization. And then in time, you can possibly start addressing the harder ones. Things like, well, what does uniform look like? Because I know uniform may not be just within your own organization. There might be a head office that deals with that or whatever. And so how can uniform be adapted to make sure that anyone who has a certain faith obligation can also wear the uniform? Things like that. So there'll be the easy wins, the celebration, and then the things that take a little bit more work. If you take it step by step and actually recognize it for it being a journey as opposed to something we're going to do the one time and then that's it, we fixed it, then you will see the long-term implications.
Thanks. That's a great way to summarize and end this week's podcast. So thanks a lot, Sahar, for joining us on A Case of the Mondays.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you for having me.
I think it's been really interesting because it's a topic, diversity and inclusion that we're obviously involved in as we speak to HR professionals all the time, but it's not something that we're really knowledgeable about. And so it's great to hear about how we can make more of an impact. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of A Case of the Mondays.